It started as a routine traffic stop. At least, that's what the officer thought. A white cop pulled over a black driver, convinced he had caught just another ordinary citizen. But as he approached the car, he had no idea he was about to make a career-altering mistake. The man behind the wheel wasn't just anyone. He was a highly decorated U.S. Army general, a man who had served his country with honor. Yet despite his rank and status, the officer's attitude didn't change. What happened next left bystanders stunned and the general humiliated. But as they say, karma has a way of setting things right. And this time, it struck back harder than anyone could have imagined. What started as an abuse of power quickly turned into a lesson neither the cop nor the general would ever forget. Stay tuned, because this story takes a turn no one saw coming. The officer's voice was firm as he demanded the driver's license and registration. The general, calm but slightly puzzled, complied without hesitation. He had been in tense situations before, on the battlefield, in high-stakes meetings, but this felt different. Something about the officer's tone, his body language, made it clear this wasn't just a routine stop. The cop barely glanced at the documents before ordering the general out of the vehicle. Onlookers watched as confusion turned to disbelief. The officer seemed determined to prove his authority, treating the general like a suspect rather than a respected leader. But what made this even more shocking was that the general hadn't done anything wrong. There were no traffic violations, no broken laws, just an assumption, one that would come back to haunt the officer. What he didn't realize was that his actions were being recorded, and soon the whole world would see what really happened. The general stepped out of the car, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. He had spent decades serving his country, leading soldiers, making critical decisions under pressure. But here on this quiet street, none of that seemed to matter. The officer's expression was rigid, his stance unyielding. It was clear this wasn't about the law. It was about control. A small crowd had started to gather. Some recorded on their phones, whispering among themselves. Others just watched in silence, sensing the tension in the air. The general remained composed, choosing his words carefully, but the officer wasn't interested in explanations. Instead, he reached for his cuffs. The clink of metal sent a ripple of disbelief through the bystanders. One voice finally broke through. "Do you even know who that is?" A man called out. But the officer didn't flinch. What he failed to realize was that his actions were about to spark something much bigger than he ever imagined. The general remained still as the officer grabbed his wrist, the cold steel of the handcuffs tightening around his skin. A lifetime of discipline kept him from reacting, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had led soldiers into battle, made life-or-death decisions, and stood before world leaders. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal, for no reason. Gasps rippled through the crowd. More people pulled out their phones, recording every second. Whispers turned into murmurs, then into voices of protest. "This isn't right," someone shouted. But the officer ignored them, his grip tightening as he pushed the general toward the squad car. Then, just as the officer reached for his radio, a voice crackled through. Another officer's voice, urgent, sharp. "Stand down immediately." The cop froze, confusion flashing across his face. But it was too late. The wheels of justice had already started turning, and his worst nightmare was just beginning. The officer hesitated, his hand still gripping the general's arm. The radio crackled again. "I said, stand down." The voice was sharper this time, filled with authority. The crowd fell silent, waiting. The general, still calm despite the cuffs digging into his wrists, turned to look at the officer's face. For the first time, there was uncertainty in his eyes. Before he could react, another patrol car screeched to a stop. A senior officer stepped out, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding before him. He took one look at the general, then at the handcuffs, and his face darkened. "Do you even know who you just arrested?" he demanded. The officer stammered, his confidence cracking. He had been so sure of his power, so convinced he was in control. But now everything was shifting. The truth was coming to light. And the consequences, they were about to hit harder than anyone expected. The officer's grip loosened as the senior officer stormed toward him, his voice laced with disbelief. "Take those cuffs off." Now, the younger cop hesitated, but under the weight of his superior's glare, his hands fumbled for the key. The moment the cuffs clicked open, the general rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He had seen this kind of treatment before, but he never expected to experience it firsthand, especially after everything he had done for his country. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift. Phones stayed up, capturing every second. But just as the officer seemed to realize the gravity of his mistake, another unexpected twist hit. The general turned to the senior officer and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I want his badge number." The officer's face drained of color. He had assumed the worst about the man he arrested. Now he was the one about to face the consequences. The officer swallowed hard, realizing there was no escaping what was coming next. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and now, standing under the weight of his mistake, he felt the full force of accountability closing in. The general didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. He didn't need to. His quiet demand carried more power than any argument. The senior officer nodded and pulled the younger cop aside, speaking in hushed but firm tones. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the moment had already been captured and shared. Within hours, the video spread, sparking discussions across the country. As the general got back into his car, he took one last look at the shaken officer. "Respect is earned," he said simply before driving away. The lesson was clear. Power isn't about authority or control. True power comes from integrity, and karma never forgets.